Picture this. You're standing in the ruins of what was once a thriving medieval town. Stone foundations stretch across the landscape, remnants of churches, homes, and farms. But here's the chilling part. This isn't in Europe. This is Greenland, one of the most hostile environments on Earth. For over 500 years, thousands of Vikings didn't just survive here. They built an entire civilization. They raised cattle, traded with Europe, and even had their own bishop. Then, sometime in the 15th century, they simply vanished. Every single person. Gone without a trace. But here's what keeps historians awake at night. How does an entire civilization, one that had survived the Black Death, climate disasters, and complete isolation from Europe, just disappear? Were they wiped out by disease? Did they flee? Or did something far more sinister happen in those final unrecorded years? The answer involves a perfect storm of factors that most people have never heard of. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this mystery has haunted archaeologists for centuries. Let me take you back to 985 CE. Eric the Red, yes, that's his actual name, has just been exiled from Iceland for murder. Instead of accepting defeat, he does what any rational Viking would do. He sails west into the unknown Atlantic Ocean with his family and followers. What he finds changes history. A massive landmass that he cleverly names Greenland, the world's first marketing campaign, since it was mostly ice and rock. But Eric wasn't lying entirely. The southern tip had fjords with grass, streams, and enough arable land to support settlements. Within a few decades, two major settlements emerge. The eastern settlement, with about 4,000 people, and the smaller western settlement with roughly 1,000. These weren't just fishing camps. They were sophisticated medieval communities with stone churches, farms, and even a cathedral. They exported walrus ivory, polar bear hides, and narwhal tusks to Europe. They imported iron, timber, and grain. For context, walrus ivory was so valuable it was called white gold. These Vikings had struck it rich in one of the most unlikely places on Earth. For over 400 years, Norse Greenland wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Archaeological evidence shows they had complex social hierarchies, with wealthy farmers owning hundreds of cattle. They built over 300 farms, 16 churches, and even a monastery. The eastern settlement's main church could hold 340 people. They had their own bishop, appointed directly by the Pope. These people weren't isolated barbarians. They were connected to medieval European culture and politics. They navigated by the stars, traded across thousands of miles of ocean, and adapted European farming techniques to subarctic conditions. They even made it to North America 500 years before Columbus, establishing temporary settlements in what's now Newfoundland. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Around 1350, something begins to go wrong. The western settlement, 1,000 people living in one of the most remote places on Earth, starts to fail. The first clue lies in ice core data from Greenland's glaciers. Starting around 1300, temperatures begin dropping significantly. This isn't just, it got a bit colder. This is the beginning of what historians call the Little Ice Age. During the medieval warm period when the Vikings first arrived, Greenland's climate was relatively mild. You could actually grow hay and barley. But as temperatures dropped, the growing season shortened. Winters became longer and more brutal. Archaeological analysis of Norse bones from this period reveals something disturbing: signs of malnutrition. The average height of Norse Greenlanders decreased over time. Their teeth show stress lines from periods of starvation. But climate change alone doesn't explain what happened. Plenty of Arctic peoples survived the Little Ice Age. The Inuit, who had been living in Greenland alongside the Norse for centuries, adapted and thrived. So why couldn't the Vikings? The answer reveals a fatal flaw in Norse strategic thinking, one that would doom their entire civilization. The Norse Greenlanders had built their entire society around European farming and livestock. They cleared land for pastures, imported cattle, and grew hay. Their identity, their economy, their culture, everything was tied to being European farmers in the Arctic. Meanwhile, the Inuit had developed sophisticated hunting techniques, perfectly adapted to Arctic conditions. They hunted seals through breathing holes in the ice, used kayaks for whale hunting, and had complex seasonal migration patterns following Arctic wildlife. Here's the critical point. Archaeological evidence shows the Norse Greenlanders knew about Inuit hunting methods. They traded with them, fought with them, and lived alongside them for centuries. But they refused to adopt their techniques. This wasn't ignorance. This was cultural stubbornness. The Norse saw themselves as European Christians, not Arctic hunters. Adopting Inuit ways would have meant abandoning their identity. So instead, they doubled down on farming in an increasingly hostile climate. As the climate deteriorated, they kept trying to make European agriculture work in subarctic conditions. They cut down the last trees for fuel and building materials. They overgrazed their pastures. They created an ecological disaster that made their situation even worse. But the environmental crisis was only part of the perfect storm. Back in Europe, the Black Death had killed 1/3 of the population. The demand for luxury goods like walrus ivory collapsed. Meanwhile, Portuguese traders had found new sources of ivory in Africa that were cheaper and easier to obtain. The last recorded ship from Europe to Greenland arrived in 1410. After that, silence. The Norse Greenlanders were completely cut off from the outside world, just as their local environment was becoming impossible to survive in. Archaeological evidence from the final period is haunting. The last Norse Greenlanders were burning their own furniture for fuel. They were eating their dogs, something that would have been unthinkable in their culture. They were making tools from whale bones because they had no metal left. Some historians believe they eventually abandoned their settlements and tried to sail back to Europe in the early 1400s. Others think they integrated with Inuit communities, giving up their European identity entirely. But here's what we know for certain. The Norse Greenlanders didn't disappear because of any single catastrophe. They disappeared because they couldn't adapt their fundamental worldview to changing circumstances. They were brilliant navigators, skilled farmers, and successful traders. But when their environment changed, they chose cultural purity over survival. It was a cascading systems failure. Climate change disrupted their agriculture, which weakened their health and population. Economic isolation cut off their trade networks. Cultural inflexibility prevented them from adopting survival strategies they knew worked. Each factor amplified the others until the entire system collapsed. The Western settlement was abandoned first, around 1350. The Eastern settlement held out longer, but the last definitive evidence of Norse presence dates to around 1450. After that, 5 centuries of European civilization in Greenland simply ended. What makes this story so haunting isn't just that they died, it's that they chose to die as Europeans rather than live as something else. In their minds, survival without their cultural identity wasn't really survival at all. The Norse Greenland collapse isn't just ancient history. It's a case study in how sophisticated civilizations fail. It shows us that intelligence, skill, and determination aren't enough if you can't adapt your core assumptions to changing realities. Today, we face our own perfect storms: climate change, economic disruption, technological transformation. The question isn't whether we're smart enough to solve these problems. It's whether we're flexible enough to change how we think about them. Archaeologists are still uncovering new evidence about what happened to the Norse Greenlanders. Every year brings new discoveries that add pieces to this 600-year-old puzzle. If you found this analysis as fascinating as I did, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into historical mysteries that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature. And here's a question for the comments. What modern situations remind you of the Norse Greenland predicament? Where do you see cultural inflexibility preventing adaptation to changing circumstances? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another civilization that faced impossible choices and the surprising decisions they made.